What up, AP Euro students? So I thought I would try to give a quick recap video of printing press and try to help you set up your LEQ essays. Don't have much time. I'm here in the inner sanctum of teacher world. All right, so context. If we're trying to think about the significance of the printing press, I think it's important to note what happened before there was a printing press, right? So before that, knowledge was controlled by the church and there was very few books to be found, right? There were limited copies, but to be fair, there were also limited audiences. Most of the people who needed to read or had literacy were clergy members, or they were government officials, lawyers, professors, the highest level of academia. And so that was about it. Most books then were handwritten by monks, right? So this is a scriptorium where all day long you just copy books by hand, which meant that the price was extremely high, not just for the materials, but the amount of labor it took to create said books. Okay, so the printing press comes along. Your evidence, your argument, that's up to you how you want to argue this. And so I'll leave that up to you. Some things that I would throw in there. To me, I think the greatest impact of the printing press, truthfully, is how it allowed people to challenge authority. And I would argue, for complexity, that it wasn't increasing literacy rates or literature, right? So I would be trying to disprove the other argument. And so the reason why I would say that, all right, let's look specifically at the undermining of secular authority and the undermining of religious authorities, though the Protestant Reformation. So 1517, Martin Luther creates the 95 Theses, and although he didn't print them, 300 copies of his 95 Theses were immediately run off that year and spread around. Not to mention the countless ones that we don't really know the total detail, but we're talking about hundreds of copies of something out on the streets, creating an awareness, a anti-church sentiment based on their criticism of indulgences. By 1522, Luther had 1,000 copies of his New Testament that he created in the Wartburg went to the printers. Okay, by the time he died in 1546, 100,000 copies of his printed New Testament were sold. So that shows you the growing popularity and the usage of this technology. By 1611 copies of the King James Bible were printed, which, although maybe not anti-establishment, it was a distinctly English Protestant version of the Bible, not a Catholic version. And so both Luther's Bible and the King James are also then vernaculars, right? Whether in German or in English, they are not in Latin, which is, again, challenging the authority of the church. Right? It's getting information into the minds of the average person, which is fantastic. Not to mention all the countless pamphlets, communications, etchings, things that we've looked at this year in class that is meant to target a common audience. Remember, we talked about Simon Fish and how he was writing in kind of a phonetic way, which became an English vernacular. And so I threw in here an example of secular challenge of power as well. So remember, we talked about Spain and their control over the Netherlands, which would eventually create a Protestant desire to break away from Catholic Spain. But it was really a political desire to get a foreign king, the Spanish king, right, Philip II, out of their country. And so here's an etching that was printed using the printing press, showing the Spanish Inquisition killing innocent people of the Netherlands. Now, proof of the success, how I would argue my evidence is I would look to the fact that the church was really aware of the success of this printing press. They had used it in 1517 to make their indulgences that Luther was mad about. And by 1559, the Catholic Church is actively trying to suppress printing presses, censoring the press. In 1559, they also used the printing press to issue the Index of Banned Books, which tells us that books had been banned and were gaining popularity and were damaging the message of the Catholic Church, right? That they had to suppress those counterpoints. That wasn't exclusively a religious thing. Secular leaders were doing it too. So to give something contemporary to that event in 1538, Henry VIII, right, already by this point had passed the Act of Supremacy, making him the head of a Protestant Anglican church and the King of England. Well, he also then was requiring anything printed in England to have a stamp of approval by him, right? So that tells us that print was seditious. It was questioning both his secular and his religious authority. When you think about things like the Pilgrimage of Grace, for example, people were challenging his authority. So then to add that complexity, if I were going to try to bring this thing on home, I'm going to make the argument that it was not the impact on literacy and literature that was the most significant thing. And my argument there would look at the fact that you had fewer King James Bibles made than Luther's New Testaments, right? They were comparable in size, although separated by maybe 70, 80 years. Although I know 1759 is outside of the 1650 time period, I think contextually it is important to note that something as famous as Voltaire and his most important book, Candide, there are only 1,000 original print copies made of Candide in 1579. And so we're in the heart of the Enlightenment, we're post-scientific revolution, and yet we just don't have that many copies being made. And the argument that I would make there is because we still have a limited audience. Although literacy rates maybe were improving, you're still really talking about the elite in society that had access to these, right? Mainly nobles, the academic intelligentsia of Europe. That's just not that many people. So not only were people not literate enough to really consume print, we also have the very high costs. So even though books were cheaper than they were when they were handwritten manuscripts, they still were very expensive, right? When we talked about Diderot's encyclopedia during the 1700s, right, it would have cost most people like their entire life's income, right? I mean, it was expensive stuff. And so because of that, it's not really until the industrial age of like mass production of print, and also the industrial age because people were earning an income that was spendable income that they could use to buy, leisure products like a book or a newspaper. And also the creation of like government institutions like libraries during the greater age of like utilitarianism of the Industrial Revolution, where people had free or cheap copies access to these things. So I hope that helps you kind of wrap your mind around things that you could argue, and good luck on your LEQ.